All right, so this is on these dimensions here. This is just a rough sand. We're not doing a finishing sand. All I'm doing is I'm knocking off these edges, the Sharpie points and stuff like this, so that I don't scratch myself. And then we'll do a fine sand. Then we'll move. We'll do a fine sand later, but then we'll move to cut this off and then fit this, and then we'll come back and do a final sand. But I did want to point out here, as you're sanding here, you always want to use a straight edge. You spend a lot of time at this point making sure that this is the right dimensions, and you don't want this to be concave in here. And so while you're sanding in this area, always use a straight edge. And so this is just an example. This is 80 grit, and all you're doing, as you'll notice as you sand, you're just going to sand sort of like you're sawing, so to speak. And you're always going to stay in that motion as you're moving around. So again, it's just a tip with regards to sanding, that you don't want to sand in one place any long period of time, because that will create like a divot. And so you always want to use a straight edge while you're sanding. Okay, so these are cabinet scrapers, and you'll absolutely want to get these. They're fairly inexpensive. You can look up YouTube on ways to sharpen them. That's always a little bit of a trick for me, getting these sharp. But what these cabinet scrapers do, and my beer assistant will zoom in, you'll notice that there's all these little tooling marks. Now sandpaper is probably your first pass that you're going to go on these, but sandpaper is probably the worst thing you can ever put on a piece of wood. I prefer chisels and cabinet scrapers, but where they come in handy is if you can kind of zoom in, you'll notice I have these little tooling marks here. And to sand that down, you're going to end up sanding a whole lot here just to get that to be sanded down. So what a cabinet scraper does is, if you watch, it actually just slowly shaves off that area. Now obviously you don't want to stay in one spot, but you'll notice instead of sanding, it's a slightly different, it's more of a chiseling effect. And you catch that edge, and you can absolutely, with just a few scrapes there, you absolutely can remove all those tooling marks. You can find them pretty much at any woodworking shop. You find them online. And then again, as I said, for sharpening, you can just look on YouTube. I'm not an expert on sharpening these things, but I have several of them. I keep them sharp, and they're an absolutely must for a woodworker. Okay, so now we've completed our initial sanding of the buttstock, really just to get the sharp edges off here and get the majority, if not the majority, of our tooling marks out of here, and just get this in a spot that we're ready to continue working with it. Just to reiterate, there's not been any heavy sanding up here. This will be the last step that we'll do. So okay, so we are just about there. Let's go over a couple of things. So this part, when you put this in here, you notice it should, without much effort at all, it should just drop down in there. And I see that I'm bottomed out on my hole down there, so that's all good. What I do want to bring your attention to is right here. You'll notice on this edge right here is perfect. On this edge right here, it looks great all the way around to right about here through to about here. So what could have caused that? Well, when I was cutting, if you have your cutter in here and it's going along and it's too deep, the cutter can actually oscillate just a little bit in here, and that could be attributable to why there's probably about a 3/1000, 4/1000 gap right in there. Now this will get cleaned up when I'm finished. You won't even see that, but I just want to let you know, even as you're cutting, you want to only take, as you're going down, as you're plunging down, you only want to take small amounts at a time. And if you do get a little too aggressive, that's what will happen, is your cutter will actually kind of oscillate in there. Now, the other thing that could have caused that gap is the softness of the wood, the grain, depending on the grain, direction of the grain, and how that cutter was cutting into it. I always want my cutter, it's rotating clockwise. So on the left side, I'm moving this direction. On this side, I'm moving in this direction. That way the cutter's always cutting into it in this direction. Now, the other thing that could attributed to that little bit of a gap there is the softer hardness of the wood. The cutter, if you hit a hard, if all this is hard and you hit a soft spot, the cutter can actually rip out a little bit more as it's cutting, and so that's why there's a slight little gap right in there. But like I said, this has actually turned out to be very nice. When I'm finished with this and I do my glass bedding, there'll be no evidence at all of any gaps in there at all. But at the same time, you still want, even though you do your glass bedding, and we'll cover that later, when you do your glass bedding, you want this part to be sitting in here freely. You don't want it to have to be forced in there. You want the part to be in and out of there very freely, just like that. And then you do your final look to see if you're hitting any high spots. If you do see a high spot, it's literally like right here. You can see a little bit of a touching right there. When I sand, this is about all I'm doing. I'm just hitting that spot just about like that, trying to stay on that spot alone. And then I'll put this part back in again. And that's sort of the process that you'll go through. Very slow. This isn't anything that you're in any big hurry to do. See, it's still got a spot right there, but you don't want to over sand, and so that's why you're always just doing a little bit at a time. Eventually, I will use this inlet black just to look for any additional spots that might be high or low. But as you're sanding and you put that part back in there, you'll still see where it's been touching. It'll kind of rub relative to where you've been sanding, and so I may move from a 120 grit down to a 320 grit or a 220 grit to just continue sanding in there, just so that I don't have any real high spots as I'm coming in and out of there. And so that is almost done. You can still see I still got a little bit of a spot right there. It won't take much at all to keep this part from going in there. So at this point, we're good to go with the bottom trigger plate. And now what we're ready to do is start working on the receiver and having it fit in there. Now remember, this is a recessed area, so this receiver should slide in. And at this point, I've got a little bit of a high spot here in my edges, and I'll slowly work that in just like I was doing down there on the trigger plate. I'll slowly work this in, and then I'll eventually start marking and chiseling this out so that the groove is going to look something like this. And that's for this is particularly for Ithaca 4E, the way it's recessed in there. So that's what we're going to do now, and we'll come back when I'm closer to being finished and having more to talk about. Thanks. Ready?
Let's go.
Right, so we've now completed chiseling this out for our fit, and we're now ready and testing in here to put the receiver in here. Receiver fits pretty good. I don't know if you can zoom in on here, but these are really nice margins that fit very, very well. There's a slight gap there, but when I do the glass bedding, here, all that'll go away. That's pretty doggone good there. A little bit of a gap back here, but this tang will come down when it tightens. But you'll notice in here we're good, and we got a little bit of gap. But on the Ithaca 4E, when you tighten it down, this tang will actually flex down a little bit. Really, the only thing left here now is on the trigger plate. And the trigger plate should drop down in there without any trouble. Come back out here just a little bit. Trigger plate should just drop down into place there, and it does pretty much there's still a slight bind over, looks like I've got a little bit of a slight bind on this side, but that is almost there with regards to this. And again, you don't want to be putting any pressure on this. That trigger plate, it should just drop down in there. And so you can see it's pretty close. Typically you don't want to make too many adjustments on the top here. Most of the adjustments you want to make are down here on the bottom. If this needs to tilt over or move, this needs to move over a little bit, I'll make all of my adjustments down here, because then when you put your trigger guard in here, it's not as sightly as if you had it up on the top. But it's still, you're going to have to work with it to get it to fit in there. It usually does take just a little bit of time sanding and filing it to finally get it fine-tuned and to drop in there. All right, so we need to drill the tang holes. The first one we're going to do is this front one. It's a wood screw. To get my center, that's about 1/4 of an inch. And what I did was I just turned that on my lathe. That's going to go down there. I used a 11/32 as a center. And I went ahead and used a handheld drill. I like doing these by hand on some of these, or at least get them started by hand. Use a handheld drill to drill that into depth. Then what I did was took an 11/64 and went ahead and went down a little bit more, a little bit further. I finished it off with a 1/4 inch because this particular screw, that's about a 1/4 inch right there. So I went down just a smidge down in there for the head of that screw to go down there. Now on wood screws, just a tip, wood screws are going to be pretty tight. And so what I did was I measured, to get that, I measured the inside of the trough to get my measurement. That's how I got 11/32. It's going to be kind of tight in there. What you want to do is, just as a tip, take some soap. It doesn't matter what kind of soap, and just run some soap on here so that then when you go ahead and get this going in there, that the soap acts sort of as a lubricant. Now I've already gone ahead and done this, so that's why it's drilling in. But I would have turned in 1/2 turns at a time, going in, working that in, and that soap acts as a lubricant to go ahead and get your screws and get that wood screw going in there. And so this screw lines up right where I wanted it. Straight up and down is how we want the screw. Now on this one, what we'll do is we're going to do the same process, except because these are smaller, I'm using a 1/8 here. Being careful not to mess those threads up, but using a 1/8 in here to go ahead and dimple that to get my mark. Then I'll do the same thing on the other side with, I believe that's a 5/32 here, to go ahead and dimple that. And then we'll go out into the garage and we'll drill it just like we did on the rear tang screw, using the process that we did. I won't record that, I've already recorded it, but on the previous recordings I showed how I drilled that rear tang screw. And at that point then we're finished with these screws, and we're ready to go ahead and move to glass bedding, which will be the next step.